Two men can walk into the same room at the same time. Neither of them announces who they are. Neither of them tries to impress anyone. And yet, within a few minutes, the atmosphere around them begins to shift. When the first man speaks, people naturally listen. They pause. They give him space. His words seem to carry a certain weight. The second man might be just as intelligent. He might even work harder. But somehow the room doesn't respond to him in the same way. No one intends to disrespect him, but the attention simply moves elsewhere. For a long time, this difference fascinated me, because when you observe situations like this carefully, the explanation is rarely what people assume. It isn't always money. It isn't always status. And surprisingly, it isn't even about who talks the loudest or tries the hardest to appear confident. In fact, some of the most respected men you will ever meet are often the quietest people in the room, which raises an interesting question. If respect isn't simply about achievements, if it isn't about dominating conversations, then what exactly creates the presence of a high-value man? The answer often lies in something far more subtle than success. Psychology. Human beings are constantly reading psychological signals from each other. They notice how someone reacts under pressure. They notice whether someone changes his opinion just to keep everyone comfortable. They notice whether someone protects his time and energy or gives them away too easily. Most of these signals happen quietly, almost invisibly. Yet the human brain is constantly interpreting them. Over time, I started paying closer attention to these patterns, and the more I observed them, the more I began to notice something interesting. Respect is rarely given to the person who tries the hardest to earn it. Instead, it tends to appear around the person who carries himself with a certain stability. A man who doesn't rush to prove his worth. A man who doesn't panic under pressure. A man who doesn't feel the need to explain himself to everyone around him. And personally, this realization changed the way I looked at social dynamics. There was a time when I believed respect came from doing more, working harder, talking more confidently, trying to show people what I was capable of. But eventually I started noticing something almost paradoxical. The harder someone tries to convince the world of their value, the more the world sometimes questions it. Meanwhile, the men who seem completely comfortable with themselves often create a very different response. They move more slowly. They react less emotionally. They don't rush to gain approval. And because of that, people begin to treat them differently. Not because they are pretending to be someone they are not, but because they understand a few psychological principles that quietly shape how people perceive them. Principles about boundaries, about emotional control, about purpose, and about the subtle signals that communicate self-respect. In this audiobook, we're going to explore those psychological rules. Not tricks, not manipulative tactics, but deeper patterns in human behavior that influence how respect, influence, and attraction naturally form. And once you start recognizing these patterns, something interesting begins to happen. The way people respond to you slowly starts to change. Not because you're trying to impress anyone, but because you're no longer sending the signals that quietly reduce your value. And in the next chapter, we'll begin with one of the most powerful psychological shifts a man can make. The day he stops chasing approval and starts living by his own principles. Chapter 1. The day you stop chasing approval. There is a quiet turning point that eventually appears in the life of many men. It doesn't arrive dramatically. There's no announcement, no moment where everything suddenly changes overnight. Instead, it begins with a small realization. A realization that many of the choices a man makes throughout his life are shaped by one invisible force, the desire for approval. Approval from co-workers, approval from friends, approval from family, approval from people whose opinions may not even matter in the long run. For a long time, this pursuit feels completely reasonable. After all, wanting to be liked is part of being human. No one wants to be rejected. No one enjoys conflict. So many men develop a habit that seems harmless at first. They agree quickly. They try to avoid disappointing people. They make themselves constantly available. And slowly, without even noticing it, their behavior begins to revolve around keeping everyone else comfortable. But something interesting happens when approval becomes the center of a man's decisions. People start to feel it, not consciously, but psychologically. The human mind is remarkably sensitive to signals of certainty and uncertainty. When someone constantly adjusts themselves to fit everyone else's expectations, it sends a subtle message. This person is unsure of their own ground. And once that signal appears, the dynamic between people quietly begins to change. Imagine a simple situation that happens in workplaces every day. A group of people are sitting in a meeting discussing an important decision. One person proposes an idea. Another person disagrees. Then someone else speaks, and instead of sharing what he actually thinks, he quickly says something like, "Yeah, I think that makes sense." Maybe he doesn't fully agree. Maybe he simply wants to avoid tension. But the moment he does that, something subtle happens in the room. People begin to sense that his opinion is flexible, perhaps even negotiable. Meanwhile, another person in the room might calmly say, "I see the point, but I don't think that approach will work." He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't try to dominate the conversation. He simply expresses his view clearly. Strangely enough, the room often reacts differently to these two people. The second person is not always liked more, but he is very often respected more. And that reveals an important psychological truth. Respect rarely grows from the need to be liked. It grows from the ability to stand comfortably in your own position. Personally, this realization took time for me to understand. There was a period in my life when I believed that respect came from constantly proving my value, working harder, being helpful to everyone, making sure people around me were satisfied. And while those efforts were appreciated, something always felt slightly off. People were friendly. People were polite. But the deeper sense of respect I expected never fully appeared. Over time, I began noticing something paradoxical. The more someone tries to prove their worth to the world, the more the world sometimes questions it. Meanwhile, the men who seem completely comfortable with themselves often create a different effect. They don't rush to explain every decision. They don't immediately adjust their opinions to match the room. And they don't treat approval as something they desperately need, because their sense of direction comes from somewhere else, their principles. When a man begins to live by clear principles instead of chasing approval, something subtle changes in the way people interact with him. He becomes harder to pressure, harder to manipulate, harder to ignore. And interestingly, this transformation rarely begins with something dramatic. It often begins with something very small, the ability to say no, not aggressively, not emotionally, just calmly and clearly. A calm no carries a powerful psychological signal. It communicates that your time has value. It communicates that your priorities matter. And it communicates that your decisions are not dependent on pleasing everyone around you. And at first, this shift can feel uncomfortable. People who are used to your constant agreement may react with surprise. Some may push back. Some may test your boundaries. But something important happens over time. The people who genuinely respect you will begin to respect you even more. And the people who only valued your compliance will slowly fade away. That process is not a loss. It's clarity. Clarity about who respects your boundaries. Clarity about who values your presence. And clarity about the kind of life you are building. When approval stops being the center of a man's decisions, something powerful begins to take its place. Self-respect. And self-respect sends one of the strongest psychological signals a person can project. Because once a man stops chasing approval, he becomes far more difficult to control. And interestingly enough, that shift often changes the way the entire world responds to him. In the next chapter, we'll explore another psychological pattern that quietly separates respected men from everyone else. It becomes visible in moments of pressure, because when tension appears, the way a man reacts often reveals more about his true strength than anything he says. And the men who remain calm in those moments often hold a kind of power that many people underestimate. Chapter 2. Why calm men are the hardest to control. There is a moment that reveals more about a person than almost anything else. It's not when life is easy. It's not when everything is going according to plan. It's when something goes wrong. Pressure appears. Someone disagrees with you. A plan fails. A situation becomes uncomfortable. In those moments, people reveal something deeper than confidence. They reveal how much control they truly have over themselves. And interestingly enough, one of the most powerful psychological signals a man can project is something very simple: calmness. Not the kind of calmness that comes from avoiding problems, but the kind that appears when a person is fully aware of what's happening and still chooses not to react emotionally. Because when tension enters a situation, many people instinctively watch how others respond. Some people react immediately. They raise their voices. They defend themselves quickly. They try to win the argument. Others do something very different. They pause. They listen. They respond slowly and deliberately. And that small difference changes the entire dynamic of the situation. The reason is deeply psychological. Human beings constantly look for signals of stability. When someone reacts emotionally to every challenge, it suggests that the situation is controlling them. But when someone remains calm under pressure, the signal is completely different. It suggests that they are in control of themselves, and possibly the situation as well. Think about a moment you may have experienced at work. Two people disagree during a meeting. One person reacts immediately. Their voice becomes sharper. They interrupt. They try to push their point through quickly. Meanwhile, the other person remains quiet for a moment. They take a breath. They think about the response. Then they calmly explain their perspective. Even if both people have strong opinions, the room usually reacts differently to them. The calm person often appears more confident, more composed, and strangely enough, more authoritative. This happens because emotional control is interpreted by the brain as psychological strength. In many ways, calmness acts like a signal that says, "This situation does not overwhelm me." And when people sense that signal, they respond to it instinctively. Personally, this was something I had to learn over time. There were moments in the past when I believed reacting quickly showed strength. And if someone challenged an idea, I would defend it immediately. If something went wrong, I felt the urge to fix it right away. But over time, I began to notice something interesting. The men who seemed the most respected in difficult situations were rarely the ones reacting the fastest. They were often the ones who reacted the least. At first, this seemed counterintuitive. Why would saying less make someone appear stronger? But the answer lies in how the human mind interprets behavior. When someone reacts instantly to every stimulus, it suggests they are being pulled by the situation. Their emotions move with every external trigger. But when someone pauses before reacting, the signal changes completely. It suggests that their response is not automatic. It is chosen. And that small pause creates a powerful psychological effect. And it communicates that their emotions are not easily manipulated. This is one reason calm men are often the hardest people to control. Because emotional reactions are one of the easiest ways people influence each other. If someone knows exactly what will trigger you, anger, defensiveness, insecurity, they can guide your reactions without much effort. But when a person does not react immediately, that leverage disappears. Without emotional reactions to work with, manipulation becomes much more difficult. Calmness creates distance between stimulus and response, and in that distance, real control exists. Another interesting thing about calm behavior is how it changes the perception of confidence. Loud confidence often tries to prove itself. It speaks quickly. It explains a lot. It tries to dominate attention. Quiet confidence behaves differently. It doesn't rush. It doesn't feel the need to respond to every challenge. It simply speaks when necessary and remains silent when words aren't needed. And because of that, people begin to treat that person differently. Their presence feels more stable. Their reactions feel more deliberate. Their words carry more weight. This doesn't mean calm men never feel emotions. They experience the same frustrations, pressures, and disagreements that everyone else does. The difference is not the absence of emotion, it's the management of it. They understand that not every situation requires an immediate reaction. Some situations require observation, some require patience, and some require nothing at all. In fact, one of the most powerful habits a person can develop is the ability to insert a small pause between what happens and how they respond. That pause might only last a few seconds, but it changes everything. It allows the mind to step back from the emotional impulse and choose a response instead of simply reacting. And when someone consistently does this, their entire presence begins to change. They appear more grounded, more controlled, more difficult to shake. People begin to realize something about them. They are not easily provoked, they are not easily pressured, and they are not easily manipulated. In other words, they are not easily controlled. And interestingly enough, this kind of calmness often becomes one of the defining traits of men who carry quiet authority. Not because they are trying to dominate situations, but because their stability makes others naturally adjust around them. In the next chapter, we'll explore another psychological shift that dramatically changes how people interact with a man. It's the moment he learns something many people struggle with for years, the ability to say no without feeling the need to explain himself. Chapter 3. The moment you learn to say no without explaining. There is a small word that quietly shapes the direction of a man's life. A word that seems simple, yet many people struggle to use it. That word is no. At first glance, saying no doesn't appear particularly powerful. It feels like a basic part of everyday communication. But psychologically, the ability to say no, calmly and without guilt, can completely transform how others perceive you. And more importantly, it transforms how you perceive yourself. Many men grow up learning a subtle habit that feels polite and responsible. When someone asks for help, they immediately try to accommodate. When someone requests their time, they try to make space for it. When someone expects something from them, they try to meet that expectation. On the surface, these behaviors appear generous. But over time, something interesting begins to happen. A man who never says no slowly teaches the world that his time, energy, and priorities are always negotiable. People don't necessarily mean to take advantage of this. In fact, many people won't even realize it's happening. But the human mind naturally adjusts to the signals it receives. If someone always agrees, others begin to expect agreement. If someone always makes themselves available, others begin to assume that availability. And eventually, the person who once seemed generous can start to feel overwhelmed, stretched thin, or quietly frustrated. What makes this dynamic even more complicated is the emotional discomfort many people feel when they try to set boundaries. Saying no can trigger guilt. It can create the fear of disappointing someone, and it can even create anxiety about being misunderstood. So instead of saying no clearly, many people develop a different habit. They explain, they over-explain, they justify their decision in great detail. I'm really sorry, things are just a bit busy right now. I would help, but I have so many things going on this week. I wish I could, but maybe next time. The intention behind these explanations is understandable. People want to soften the refusal. They want to show that they are still kind, still cooperative, still considerate. But psychologically, something subtle happens when someone constantly feels the need to justify their boundaries. It signals uncertainty. When a man explains every no as if he needs permission to say it, the message unintentionally becomes, "My decision might change if I can be persuaded." In contrast, a man who sets boundaries calmly and simply communicates something very different. He might say something as straightforward as, "I won't be able to do that," or "That doesn't work for me." There is no anger in the statement. There is no apology for having priorities, just clarity. And clarity sends a powerful psychological signal. It shows that the person speaking is comfortable with their decision. This kind of clarity often surprises people at first, especially if they are used to dealing with individuals who always explain themselves. But over time, the effect becomes very noticeable. People begin to treat the person differently. Requests become more thoughtful. Conversations become more respectful. And something interesting begins to happen to the man himself as well. His life becomes more focused. Because every time someone says yes to something unnecessary, they're also saying no to something important. Time is limited, energy is limited, attention is limited. The ability to say no protects all three. Personally, learning this lesson required a shift in perspective. There was a period when saying no felt uncomfortable. It felt like disappointing people. It felt like risking relationships or creating tension. But eventually, I noticed something important. The people who genuinely respected my time did not become upset when I set boundaries. In fact, they often respected those boundaries even more. Meanwhile, the people who reacted negatively were often the ones who benefited the most from the absence of boundaries in the first place. That realization clarified something essential. Setting boundaries does not damage healthy relationships. It reveals unhealthy ones. Another interesting psychological effect of boundaries is how they influence perceived value. In many areas of life, scarcity creates value. Things that are rare are often treated with greater care and respect. Time works the same way. When someone gives unlimited access to their time and attention, it becomes easy for others to overlook its value. But when someone protects their time carefully, people instinctively begin to treat that time as more valuable. This doesn't require arrogance or distance. It simply requires clarity. A man who understands his priorities no longer feels the need to accommodate every request. He chooses where his energy goes. He decides what deserves his attention. And because of that, his time naturally becomes more meaningful. There is another important shift that happens when someone becomes comfortable saying no. Their sense of identity becomes stronger. Instead of constantly adapting to the expectations of others, they begin to build their life around their own principles. They decide what matters. They decide what doesn't. And over time, those decisions create a structure that shapes the direction of their life. Without boundaries, life becomes reactive. With boundaries, life becomes intentional. And that difference changes everything. People often assume that high-value men are defined by wealth, status, or success. But in reality, many of the traits that create respect are much simpler. Clarity, emotional stability, self-respect, and the quiet ability to protect one's priorities without guilt. When a man learns to say no without feeling the need to justify himself, he communicates something powerful to the world. He communicates that his life has direction. And when someone's life has direction, people instinctively begin to treat them with greater respect. In the next chapter, we will explore another subtle psychological habit that quietly influences how people value a man. It's a pattern that often appears in people who are trying too hard to be helpful, supportive, and available. And strangely enough, the more someone makes themselves available to everyone, the less valuable their presence can sometimes become. Chapter 4. The dangerous habit of being too available. There is a subtle habit that quietly shapes how people value you. At first, it seems like a positive trait. It looks like kindness, generosity, and reliability. It feels like the responsible thing to do. The habit is simple. Always being available. Available to answer every message immediately. Available to help whenever someone asks. Available to adjust your schedule for everyone else's needs. On the surface, this behavior appears admirable. After all, being dependable is a good quality. People appreciate someone they can count on. But when availability becomes constant, something interesting begins to happen psychologically. The value of your presence slowly decreases. Not because people dislike you, not because they intentionally want to disrespect you, but because the human mind instinctively assigns value to things that are limited. Scarcity creates importance. This pattern appears everywhere in life. Rare objects are valued more than common ones. Limited opportunities feel more exciting than endless ones. Time that is difficult to access feels more meaningful than time that is always available. Human relationships follow the same psychological principle. When a man is always available, his time becomes predictable. When his time becomes predictable, it becomes easy to assume it will always be there. And when something always feels guaranteed, people begin to treat it with less urgency. Think about a common situation in everyday life. Someone sends a message late at night asking for help with something that could easily wait until tomorrow. And a man who is constantly available might respond immediately. He interrupts whatever he was doing. He rearranges his time. He shows that he is ready to help at any moment. At first, this seems generous, but if it becomes a pattern, something subtle changes. People begin to expect that availability. Soon, the requests become more frequent. The urgency increases. And the assumption grows that your time can always adjust to fit someone else's needs. Eventually, this dynamic creates an imbalance. Your schedule revolves around others, your priorities become flexible, and your energy is constantly redirected away from the things that matter most to you. Meanwhile, the people who appear to have the most influence in social and professional environments often behave very differently. They are not rude, they are not distant, but their availability is limited. When someone wants their time, it usually requires planning. Conversations happen at specific moments. Meetings are scheduled. Requests are considered rather than immediately accepted. And because their time is limited, people instinctively treat it with more respect. Personally, this was something I began noticing after observing how different people managed their time. There were individuals who seemed constantly busy, constantly responding to every request, constantly trying to be helpful to everyone around them. They were appreciated. But their presence rarely carried authority. Meanwhile, there were others who appeared calm, focused, and selective about how they used their time. They didn't rush to respond to every message. They didn't instantly adjust their plans whenever someone asked for something. And interestingly, people often treated their time as far more valuable. The difference was not arrogance, it was intentional availability. These individuals understood that time is one of the most valuable resources a person possesses, and once time is given away without thought, it cannot be recovered. Because of that, they treated their own time with care. And when someone treats their time carefully, others tend to follow the same pattern. This principle applies not only to work, but also to personal relationships. When someone is constantly available emotionally, they often become the person everyone turns to during moments of stress. At first, this may feel meaningful. Being supportive is an important part of healthy relationships. But when emotional availability becomes unlimited, something subtle can happen. The person providing support can begin to feel drained. Their role becomes predictable. And sometimes, the balance of the relationship slowly shifts. Instead of two people supporting each other, one person becomes the constant provider of attention and emotional energy. High-value men tend to avoid falling into this pattern, not because they lack empathy, but because they understand something important about sustainability. Energy must be protected. Time must be protected. Attention must be directed intentionally. Without those boundaries, even the most capable person eventually becomes overwhelmed. Another interesting psychological effect of constant availability is how it influences perceived confidence. When someone is always ready to respond immediately, it can sometimes signal that they are waiting for the next request or opportunity. But when someone is comfortable allowing time to pass before responding, it communicates something very different. It suggests that their life already contains priorities. Their schedule already contains direction. Their time is already filled with meaningful commitments, and because of that, their presence begins to feel more intentional. This doesn't mean ignoring people or behaving in a distant way. It simply means understanding that availability should be chosen, not automatic. A message does not always require an immediate response. A request does not always require an immediate agreement. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply taking time to consider. That small pause communicates something important. It shows that your attention is not scattered across every request that appears. It shows that your energy has direction, and direction creates respect. When a man becomes intentional about how he uses his time, something else begins to happen. His life becomes more focused. Instead of reacting to the needs of everyone around him, he begins to move according to his own priorities. Projects receive deeper attention, goals receive consistent effort, and the sense of constant urgency slowly disappears. This shift does not require becoming unavailable to everyone. It simply requires recognizing that availability should serve your life, not control it. A man who understands this principle becomes more selective. He chooses where his attention goes. He chooses when his time is given. And he chooses the relationships and opportunities that deserve his energy. Over time, that selectiveness creates something powerful. His presence becomes meaningful because it is no longer automatic. In the next chapter, we will explore another psychological trait that quietly defines men who command respect without needing to prove themselves. It is a form of confidence that does not require attention. In fact, it often appears in the men who speak the least. Yet somehow, when they do speak, people listen carefully. This is the strange confidence of men who no longer need validation. Chapter 5. The strange confidence of men who don't need validation. There is a type of confidence that is easy to notice. It is loud, expressive, and constantly visible. It appears in people who speak often, who dominate conversations, and who seem eager to demonstrate their abilities. This kind of confidence is familiar. It appears frequently in social situations, workplaces, and public spaces. People who display it often seem energetic and assertive. But there is another type of confidence that is far more subtle. It doesn't try to attract attention. It doesn't rush to prove itself. And it rarely needs to convince anyone of its value. This is the quiet confidence that often appears in men who no longer depend on validation from others. At first, this kind of confidence can be difficult to recognize, because it does not behave the way people usually expect confidence to behave. It doesn't interrupt conversations, it doesn't try to dominate the room, and it doesn't react strongly when someone questions it. Instead, it appears as something calmer, a steady presence. A person who speaks when they have something meaningful to say and remains silent when they do not. This difference becomes especially visible in group conversations. In many discussions, there's often someone who feels the need to respond to everything. Every opinion triggers a reply. Every topic invites commentary. Every moment of silence feels like something that needs to be filled. But occasionally, there is someone who behaves very differently. They listen more than they speak. They observe the direction of the conversation before contributing. Yes, and when they finally share their thoughts, people often pay closer attention. This happens because their words are not constant. They are deliberate. The human mind naturally gives greater value to things that are less frequent. Just as scarcity increases value in other areas of life, it increases value in communication as well. When someone speaks constantly, their words blend into the background. But when someone speaks selectively, their words carry more weight. Personally, this was another lesson that took time to understand. There were moments when silence felt uncomfortable. In group settings, it sometimes felt necessary to contribute quickly, to show engagement, to demonstrate knowledge, or simply to avoid appearing passive. But over time, something interesting became clear. The people who seemed the most respected in conversations were not always the ones speaking the most. Often, they were the ones who listened carefully. They allowed others to speak. They observed the flow of the discussion, and when they finally contributed, their perspective often shifted the direction of the conversation. This behavior sends a subtle psychological signal. It communicates that the person speaking does not feel pressure to prove themselves. Their value does not depend on constant participation. Instead, their contributions appear when they genuinely have something to add. Another interesting aspect of this quiet confidence is how it responds to disagreement. When someone depends heavily on validation, disagreement can feel threatening. If another person challenges their opinion, the instinctive response may be to defend it quickly. Voices rise, arguments escalate. The conversation becomes about winning rather than understanding. But when someone does not depend on validation, disagreement feels different. It becomes information rather than a threat. They can listen to opposing views without feeling personally attacked. They can consider other perspectives without immediately rejecting them, and if they still disagree, they express their position calmly. This response communicates a powerful psychological signal. It shows that their confidence does not depend on everyone agreeing with them. And because of that, their opinion often carries greater credibility. Another important characteristic of men who no longer seek validation is how they handle praise. For many people, the compliments trigger an immediate desire to explain themselves. They minimize their achievement, they redirect the attention, or they attempt to justify why the praise might not fully apply. But someone who is comfortable with their own value responds differently. They acknowledge the compliment calmly, they appreciate the recognition, but they do not become attached to it because their sense of worth is not built entirely on external feedback. This creates a noticeable difference in their behavior. Praise does not inflate their ego. Criticism does not destabilize their confidence. Both become forms of information rather than sources of identity. Over time, this psychological stability begins to influence how others perceive them. People sense that their reactions are not controlled by external opinions. Their decisions are not easily swayed by social pressure, and their presence carries a certain steadiness that feels trustworthy. This is one reason quiet confidence often appears powerful. It is not trying to convince anyone of its strength. It simply exists. And because it exists without effort, it often feels more authentic than louder forms of confidence. There is another reason this type of confidence is respected. It suggests that the person behind it has built something internally. They have developed principles, they have developed direction, and they have developed the ability to stand comfortably in their own perspective. This internal foundation reduces the need for constant external reinforcement. And when someone no longer depends on validation, their behavior naturally changes. They become less reactive to criticism, but less eager for approval, and less concerned with how every decision will be perceived. Instead, they focus on alignment with their own values. This shift creates something powerful. Freedom. Freedom from the constant pressure to impress. Freedom from the anxiety of social comparison. Freedom to act according to personal principles rather than temporary opinions. Over time, that freedom becomes visible in the way they carry themselves. Their movements feel calmer, their words feel measured, their decisions feel intentional, and people begin to notice. Not because the person is demanding attention, but because authentic confidence is difficult to ignore. In the next chapter, we will explore another small habit that quietly shapes how people perceive a man. It is something so simple that many people overlook its power. A small pause, and a moment between what happens and how someone responds. And surprisingly, that brief moment often determines whether a person appears reactive or truly in control. Chapter 6. The small pause that changes how people see you. There is a very small habit that quietly separates reactive people from those who appear calm, stable, and difficult to shake. It doesn't require special talent. It doesn't require intelligence or experience. In fact, it takes only a few seconds. It is simply the ability to pause before reacting. At first, this may not sound like an important skill. Most people see reactions as natural and automatic. Something happens, and the mind immediately responds. A comment is made, a mistake occurs, a disagreement appears, and the response follows almost instantly. But if you begin observing human behavior carefully, you will notice that reactions reveal far more than the words people speak. Reactions reveal emotional control. Now, and emotional control is one of the strongest psychological signals a person can project. Think about how many situations in life trigger immediate reactions. A coworker criticizes your work. Someone interrupts you while you're speaking. A message arrives that sounds disrespectful. In these moments, the mind quickly moves toward a response. The impulse might be to defend yourself, to explain your position immediately, to correct the other person before the conversation moves on. But this immediate reaction often gives away something important. It shows that the situation has taken control of your emotions. And when someone else can control your emotional state, they also gain influence over your behavior. This is why emotional reactions are often used as tools of manipulation. Some people intentionally provoke reactions. They raise their voices. They make exaggerated statements. They challenge others in ways designed to create emotional responses. Once someone becomes emotionally reactive, their ability to think clearly decreases. Their focus narrows. Their tone changes. Their decisions become faster and less deliberate. In many cases, the person who remains calm during these moments quietly gains the advantage. This is where the small pause becomes powerful. That pause may last only a few seconds. But during those seconds, something important happens. The mind shifts from reaction to observation. Instead of responding automatically, the person begins to assess the situation. What was actually said? What is the intention behind it? What response would move the conversation forward rather than escalate it? Those few seconds create space between stimulus and response. And in that space, real control appears. Personally, learning this habit required patience. There were many moments in the past when reacting quickly felt natural. If someone challenged an idea, the instinct was to defend it immediately. If a disagreement appeared, the instinct was to respond just as strongly. But over time, it became clear that reacting quickly rarely improved the situation. In fact, fast reactions often made things worse. Arguments escalated more easily. Misunderstandings multiplied. And emotional tension lingered long after the conversation ended. Eventually, something became obvious. The people who seemed the most stable in difficult situations were rarely the ones reacting the fastest. They were often the ones who paused. They listened fully, and they allowed the moment to settle before responding. And because of that, their responses carried more clarity. This pause changes how others perceive you in subtle ways. When someone reacts instantly to every stimulus, their behavior becomes predictable. Others quickly learn which words trigger frustration, defensiveness, or irritation. But when someone consistently pauses before responding, that predictability disappears. It becomes difficult to provoke them, difficult to manipulate them, and difficult to push them into emotional reactions. This creates an important psychological effect. People begin to treat them with more caution and more respect, not because they are intimidating, but because their reactions cannot be easily controlled. Another interesting aspect of this pause is how it affects communication. In conversations, people often speak while thinking at the same time. Words come out quickly, sometimes faster than the mind has fully processed the situation. This can lead to statements that feel rushed, defensive, or incomplete. But when someone pauses before speaking, their words often become clearer. They choose their language more carefully. They express ideas more calmly, and they avoid saying things they might later regret. This small delay often improves the entire conversation. Tension decreases. Misunderstandings are reduced, and discussions remain more productive. There is also a deeper psychological effect happening internally. When a person learns to pause before reacting, they begin to develop greater awareness of their emotions. Instead of being carried by anger, frustration, or impatience, they begin to recognize those feelings without immediately acting on them. This awareness creates a sense of internal stability. Emotions still appear, but they no longer dictate behavior automatically. Over time, this habit builds a reputation. People begin to see the person as steady, reliable, grounded, and perhaps most importantly, difficult to provoke. This reputation carries influence in both professional and personal environments. In professional settings, emotional stability suggests leadership potential. In personal relationships, it creates trust. People feel safer around individuals who do not react impulsively to every situation. Another benefit of the pause is that it reduces unnecessary conflict. Many arguments begin not because the original issue was serious, but because reactions escalated the situation. One emotional response triggers another. The conversation spirals, and suddenly a small misunderstanding becomes a major disagreement. But when someone pauses before responding, the escalation often stops. They respond thoughtfully rather than emotionally. And this often changes the tone of the entire interaction. What might have become a confrontation becomes a discussion instead. This does not mean avoiding difficult conversations. Strong opinions can still be expressed. Boundaries can still be enforced, but they are communicated from a place of control rather than reaction. And that difference is noticeable. Over time, the habit of pausing creates a new pattern in how a man moves through the world. He becomes less reactive to distractions, less influenced by temporary emotions, and less likely to be pulled into unnecessary conflicts. Instead, he becomes more deliberate, more focused, and more aware of how his reactions shape the situations around him. This small habit may seem insignificant, just a few seconds of silence, but those seconds can completely change how people perceive your presence. They transform reactions into choices, and when reactions become choices, control returns to the person making them. In the next chapter, we will explore another psychological trait that quietly influences how people view a man. It has less to do with how he reacts and more to do with the direction of his life. Because when a man has a clear direction, something about his presence becomes naturally more attractive and respected. Chapter 7. Why direction makes a man instantly more attractive. There is a quality that quietly changes the way people see a man. It doesn't depend on appearance, it doesn't depend on money, and it doesn't even depend on how outgoing someone is. It comes from something deeper. Direction. A man who has direction moves through the world differently from someone who does not. His decisions feel more intentional, his time feels more structured, his attention feels more focused. And even if people cannot immediately explain why, they often sense that difference. Without direction, life tends to become reactive. Days are filled with responding to whatever appears next. Messages arrive, and they are answered immediately. Opportunities appear, and they are followed without much thought. Opinions from others begin to influence decisions. Over time, and this pattern creates a life that feels scattered. Energy moves in many directions, but very little progress appears in any single one. The mind becomes busy, but the path forward remains unclear. When someone lives this way, others often sense the lack of direction, even if it is never discussed directly. Conversations drift. Plans change frequently. Goals appear vague. And the person themselves may feel uncertain about where their effort is leading. But when a man develops a clear sense of direction, something begins to shift. Direction does not require having every detail of the future planned. In fact, very few people know exactly where life will lead. Direction simply means having a guiding purpose, a sense of what matters, a sense of what deserves attention and what does not. When this clarity appears, one's behavior naturally begins to change. Decisions become easier, time becomes more structured, energy becomes more focused. Instead of reacting to every opportunity that appears, the man begins evaluating whether each opportunity aligns with his path. Some invitations are accepted, others are declined, and because of this selectiveness, his time gradually becomes more meaningful. Personally, this shift often begins with a simple question: what am I actually building? Without that question, it is easy to move through life responding to immediate demands rather than long-term priorities. But once the question appears, it begins to change the way a person sees their time. Hours that once seemed ordinary become valuable. Distractions become easier to recognize, and habits that once seemed harmless begin to feel costly. As direction creates discipline almost automatically. Not because someone is forcing themselves to work harder, but because their actions now serve something larger than the moment. Another interesting effect of direction is how it influences confidence. Many people believe confidence comes from personality, but often confidence comes from clarity. When someone knows what they are building, they become less distracted by temporary opinions. Criticism still appears, doubts still arise. But those voices carry less influence when the person already knows where they are going. This stability creates a noticeable change in behavior. Instead of constantly seeking reassurance, the man begins trusting his own decisions. Instead of comparing himself to everyone around him, he measures progress against his own path. And because of that, his presence becomes calmer. He does not feel pressure to compete with every person he meets. He does not feel the need to prove his value in every conversation. His energy moves toward his direction rather than toward constant validation. This shift often makes a man more attractive in both social and professional environments. People are naturally drawn to those who appear to know where they are going. Direction suggests purpose. Purpose suggests stability. And stability creates trust. When someone has direction, their actions begin to align with long-term goals rather than short-term reactions. They protect their time more carefully. They choose their commitments more intentionally, and they become more selective about the environments they spend time in. Over time, these small decisions begin to shape their entire life. New habits improve, focus deepens, and opportunities begin to align with the path they are building. Interestingly, direction also reduces the need for constant motivation. Motivation often fluctuates. Some days energy feels high, other days it disappears completely. But when someone has direction, progress does not depend entirely on motivation. Action becomes part of the structure of life. Even on difficult days, the path forward remains visible. This consistency creates momentum, and momentum slowly builds confidence. Confidence that is not based on temporary emotions, but on repeated action over time. There is another psychological effect of direction that people often overlook. it influences how others interact with you. When someone has no clear direction, people often offer suggestions, opinions, and advice. Everyone seems to have an idea of what that person should do next. But when someone has clear direction, those suggestions begin to decrease. People sense that the individual already knows where they are heading, and because of that, they often step back. This does not mean the person becomes isolated. Healthy advice still appears. Constructive conversations still happen, but the overall dynamic changes. The man becomes the one shaping his path rather than being shaped by the expectations of others. Over time, this independence creates something powerful. Ownership of time, ownership of decisions, ownership of the life being built. And once a man begins to feel that ownership, his presence naturally changes. His posture becomes calmer, and his conversations become more intentional. His energy becomes more focused. He no longer appears as someone searching for direction. He appears as someone moving toward it. This does not require perfection. Direction does not eliminate uncertainty. Every path contains challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But direction ensures that even difficult moments still move forward. They become part of the journey rather than interruptions to it. And that forward movement creates a sense of progress that others can feel. Because people are naturally drawn to individuals who are building something meaningful, something intentional, something that gives their actions purpose. In the final chapter, we will bring together all of the psychological patterns we have explored. Calmness, boundaries, selective availability, quiet confidence, emotional control, direction. When these traits combine, they create something powerful. A man who is not easily influenced by pressure, expectations, or manipulation. A man who is grounded in himself. And when a person reaches that level of stability, the world begins to respond to them in a very different way. Chapter 8. Becoming the man the world cannot easily shake. There is a quiet transformation that happens when a man begins to integrate everything we have explored so far. It doesn't happen overnight. It develops gradually, through small changes in mindset and behavior. But once these changes begin to take root, something fundamental shifts in how a man moves through the world. He becomes harder to influence through pressure, harder to manipulate through emotion, and harder to destabilize through the opinions of others. In other words, he becomes someone the world cannot easily shake. This transformation is not about dominance. It is not about controlling people or forcing respect. Instead, it is about developing an internal structure strong enough that external circumstances lose their ability to constantly redirect your behavior. Many people move through life reacting to everything around them. Opinions influence their decisions, emotions influence their reactions, expectations influence their direction. When someone criticizes them, their confidence drops. When someone praises them, their confidence rises. Their internal state constantly shifts depending on what happens around them. This pattern creates instability. A person who is easily affected by every external influence rarely feels grounded. But when a man begins developing the psychological habits we discussed in the previous chapters, something very different starts to appear. First, he stops chasing approval. His decisions no longer revolve around making everyone comfortable. Instead, they begin to reflect his principles. Second, he learns to remain calm under pressure. Situations that once triggered immediate reactions now receive thoughtful responses. Instead of being pulled by emotion, he begins choosing how to respond. Third, he develops boundaries. His time and energy are no longer automatically available to everyone. Requests are considered carefully. Commitments are made intentionally. Fourth, he becomes selective about his availability. His schedule begins to reflect his priorities rather than the expectations of others. Fifth, he develops quiet confidence. He no longer needs constant validation from the people around him. His sense of worth comes from within. Sixth, he learns the power of the pause. Instead of reacting immediately to every situation, he creates space between events and responses. This space allows him to think clearly and act intentionally. Seventh, he develops direction. His actions are no longer random reactions to daily events. They are part of a larger path he is building. Each of these traits may appear small on their own, but when they combine, they create something powerful. Internal stability. A man with internal stability behaves very differently from someone who is constantly reacting to the world. He does not feel pressure to defend himself in every conversation. He does not feel the need to explain every decision, and he does not allow the emotional energy of others to dictate his behavior. This stability has a noticeable effect on the people around him. Conversations become calmer, conflicts become less dramatic, and the dynamic of interactions begins to change. People sense that this person cannot be easily pushed into reactions, and when someone cannot be easily provoked, manipulated, or pressured, they become much harder to control. This does not mean life suddenly becomes free of challenges. Difficult situations still appear, criticism still exists, unexpected problems still arise. But the difference lies in how those situations are handled. Instead of reacting impulsively, the man observes. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, he analyzes. Instead of allowing the situation to control his emotions, he manages his response. This mindset transforms problems into information. Each challenge becomes something to understand rather than something to fear. And this ability to remain stable in uncertain situations often becomes one of the defining traits of respected individuals. Another interesting effect of this internal stability is how it influences leadership. People naturally look for individuals who appear grounded during moments of uncertainty. When tension rises in a group, everyone instinctively observes who remains calm. The person who appears most stable often becomes the one others begin to follow, not because they demanded authority, but because their presence creates confidence. This kind of influence is subtle but powerful. It grows naturally from behavior rather than from position, and it becomes stronger over time as people continue to observe the same patterns of stability. There is also a deeper personal benefit to becoming someone the world cannot easily shake. Life becomes quieter internally. The constant noise of approval seeking begins to fade. The pressure to respond to every opinion disappears, and the mind becomes more focused on what truly matters. Energy is no longer wasted trying to manage the expectations of everyone around you. Instead, that energy becomes available for building something meaningful. Goals receive consistent attention. Relationships become healthier, and decisions become clearer. This clarity often leads to a sense of peace that many people search for without realizing what creates it. Peace does not come from avoiding difficulty. It comes from knowing that external situations cannot easily control your internal state. When a man reaches this level of stability, something subtle changes in the way he sees the world. He becomes less concerned with proving himself, less concerned with comparing himself to others, or less concerned with reacting to every challenge that appears. Instead, he becomes focused on something much simpler, living according to his principles, building according to his direction, and responding to life with clarity rather than impulse. At that point, the definition of a high-value man begins to look very different. It is no longer about appearances or external status. It is about psychological strength, the strength to remain calm when others panic, the strength to maintain boundaries when others demand access, the strength to move forward even when approval is uncertain, and perhaps most importantly, the strength to remain grounded in who you are regardless of what the world expects from you. When a man reaches that place, something interesting happens. He stops trying to control the world around him, and ironically, that is often when the world begins responding to him with the respect he never needed to chase. By now, You may have noticed something interesting about the ideas we explored in this audiobook. None of them were about pretending to be someone you are not. None of them required manipulation, dominance, or trying to appear impressive in front of others. Instead, they all pointed towards something much quieter, a shift in the way a man relates to himself and to the world around him. Throughout life, many people are taught to focus on external signals of value: success, recognition, approval from others. These things can certainly feel rewarding, but they often create a fragile form of confidence, one that rises and falls depending on how the world responds. When praise appears, confidence grows. When criticism appears, confidence weakens. And when approval becomes uncertain, the sense of self begins to feel unstable. But the psychology of a high-value man moves in a different direction. It begins internally. It begins with the decision to stop chasing approval as the primary measure of worth. It continues with learning to remain calm in situations that once triggered emotional reactions. It grows stronger through the development of clear boundaries, protecting time, energy, and attention from being constantly redirected by others. It deepens when a man becomes selective about where his presence is given, when he learns to speak with intention rather than constantly seeking validation, when he allows a pause to exist between what happens and how he responds, and when he builds a life guided by direction rather than by the expectations of everyone around him. Each of these shifts may seem small when viewed individually, but together they create something powerful: internal stability. And from personal experience, this stability changes far more than external success ever could. There was a time when many of the pressures we discussed felt unavoidable. The pressure to respond immediately. The pressure to keep everyone happy. The pressure to explain every decision and justify every boundary. But over time, something becomes clear. The world rarely respects someone who constantly tries to prove their value. Instead, respect tends to appear around people who quietly understand their own worth. People who do not panic when disagreement appears. People who do not rush to seek approval. People who remain steady even when situations become uncertain. This steadiness creates a different kind of presence, one that doesn't demand attention but naturally earns it. And then perhaps the most interesting part of this transformation is that it rarely requires dramatic change. It often begins with small decisions, choosing not to react immediately, choosing to protect your time, choosing to express your opinion calmly even when others disagree, choosing to build a life that reflects your own principles rather than temporary expectations. Over time, these choices reshape how a man experiences the world. Situations that once felt overwhelming become manageable. Conversations that once felt stressful become easier to navigate, and the constant pressure to prove oneself begins to fade. In its place appears something far more valuable. Clarity. Clarity about what matters. Clarity about what deserves attention. Clarity about who you are and where you are going. And when that clarity becomes strong enough, the world begins to respond differently. Not because you demanded respect, but because you stopped behaving in ways that quietly reduced it. Becoming a high-value man is not about creating a perfect life. Challenges will always exist. Unexpected situations will always appear. But the difference lies in how those moments are handled. A man who understands these psychological principles does not allow every external situation to determine his internal state. Instead, he carries a sense of stability with him, and that stability becomes visible in everything he does, in his decisions, in his conversations, in the way he handles pressure, and in the direction he continues to move forward. So as you leave this audiobook, consider something simple. Not how you can impress the world around you, but how you can strengthen the psychological foundation within you. Because when that foundation becomes strong enough, something remarkable happens. You no longer need to chase respect. It begins to appear naturally.